What's happening, everybody, and welcome back. This week we are talking about interracial solidarity and liberation movements, right? And so I'm going to give you a little history of liberation movements. And before we begin, I just want to say that this is not an exhaustive list of all of the liberation and social justice movements that exist within communities of color's history or contemporary times. So let's begin this conversation with some keywords defining resistance. Now, I hope that many of you got the rest that you needed last week. Remember, rest is resistance, right? And so here is the actual definition I want us to use in this classroom of resistance, right? Resistance is the refusal, to accept or comply with something, the attempt to prevent something by action or argument, right? And so, last week we did rest as resistance, right? And so, what exactly are we refusing to accept or comply? And, within that context, it's resistance to the academic hustle, the academic grind, right? Talk about grind culture um, where you just keep on working and working and working and working, right? And so the refusal to keep working and mostly working yourself to your grave, the refusal of working, right? And to rest. That is resistance, right? And so when we're talking about resistance, we're talking about this refusal to accept or comply with something that is oppressive, right? A lot of people, theorize this concept of resistance, right? And so the resistance theory explains how resistant behaviors are both responses to social inequalities and attempts to improve social status, right? And so what does that look like? Again, we did it last week, right? The social inequalities, right, of removing rest from our daily lives. We are expected to spend 2/3 of our life working or learning or whatever responsibilities we have, and then we need more than 1/3 to rest. Rest is not just sleeping, right? And rest, right? It also improves our body's function, right? And if you have a healthy body, right? If your body is functioning the way it's supposed to, right? Uh, then you live longer. That improves the chances of how long you live, right? And so when we think about resistance, right, we're refusing to accept or comply with not just something, but in this instance, and what we're talking about, social inequalities, oppression, right? And we're also resisting to improve our social status or our status or our, in the example's case, our bodies, right? And so this leads me to this not the concept, but where can we practice resistance? Where are sites of resistance? And so family as resistance, right? And this is, multiple ways you could look at family as a site of resistance. One is, you can reflect on the tools, the opportunities, the lessons that you learned from your family, right? Because a lot of those tools are there to help you survive in a society that is oppressive, right? And it could also, on the flip side of that, be a physical site of resistance, right? Um, you could be a part of an activist family or organizing family. For example, families that goes to protest, right? Or even, the examples of mothers and fathers or parents, right? Going to the school to advocate for their child, right? That is examples of family as a site of resistance. And of course, then you have the next level, which is, the expanded level, is your community, right? Your community as a site of resistance, your neighborhood, your friend groups, right? Um, your churches, right? These are community sites of resistance, right? There's many things in history that shows the church as a site of resistance, and churches are a part of the community's fabric in most cases, cultural fabric, right? Um, and so, that's just one example. And then if we go even further out, right, expanding our concepts of sites of resistance, both, you know, and not even just both, but intellectually, emotionally, physically, right? All of these ways that resistance, that sites can be a form of resistance, right? And so the last, it's more of a macros, is in these institutions, right? In these social institutions, such as schools and workplaces, right? I think about unions a lot as sites of resistance. Unions are normally associated with labor, workplace, right? Unions, and how a lot of workers are organizing around better pay and other non-oppressive ways of treating someone who is laboring for you, right? And so most of the liberation movements, social justice movements, are on its surface fighting for civil rights, rights that was supposed to be afforded us under the U.S. Constitution, right? But at its core is really about liberation, right? The freedom to, right? And so when we talk about civil rights is defined as government sanctioned freedoms and privileges designed to promote equal opportunity. It includes the right to a fair trial, the right of each adult in the United States to vote, right? Adult meaning 18 and over, the right to not face discrimination in employment, the right to have equal access to education, right, et cetera, et cetera. It does not promise, however, equality in outcomes, right? It only provides initial protection from being discriminated against and equality of opportunity. Now, these came about, right, as a result of one of the major civil rights movement, right? One of the major social justice movements known as the civil rights movement, and that was led by the black community, right? But they're not the only social justice movement, not the only liberation movement that existed that really did fight for these quote unquote government sanctioned freedoms and really, just the freedom to live, right? And so I want to talk about, some of those. And so I want to talk about some of those examples. I think I mentioned earlier when we were talking about, sites of resistance, institutions as sites of resistance, the workplace, right? And so labor unions played a major role in creating or equality, quote unquote, equality opportunities for people of color, communities of color, and other marginalized communities to get fair and equal pay, right? And so, labor unions are teams of individuals across gender, race, ethnic, and other social identities coming together to guarantee the things that you care about, right? It within the workplace, right? And we're talking about wages, like being able to afford to live in the Bay Area and not have to always hustle in order to be able to afford to live in the Bay Area. The Bay Area is expensive, y'all. And I see my students just like hustling, right? And again, being sucked into that grind culture. I mean, it's all connected, y'all. It's all connected. But labor unions, and I want to say not all workplaces have unions. I think all workplaces should have a union because when you have a union, you have an institution within an institution, right? You have the union within your workplace that is there to protect your rights as a worker, as a laborer, right? Um, and so, you can, negotiate wages. You can negotiate scheduling, things like that, that usually when you're at will employees, if you don't agree, you can get fired and replaced like that. So even with, unions, you have job security. Things that I think every person desires, right? Workers who want to have that security, that stability. Um, Labor unions are those sites of resistance that at the macro level that allow or that support in creating quote unquote equality across different various ethnic and racial lines. And so as a result of racial discrimination in the workplace, right? Both union and civil rights activists understood that labor rights are human rights and that to constrain a person's liberty, to be able to choose what you want to do, right? I think about the STEM field and how a lot of women and women of color specifically are pushed out of that field and how it's male dominated, right? So the ability to choose one's work, to earn enough to support your family or yourself, you know what I mean? To do whatever you need to do, right? These are human rights. And so if we're fighting, if we're striking, right, for better wages, if we're striking for better hours, right, and better pay, that is inherently a human right. If you're gonna exchange your labor, right, for wages, it should be enough that you don't have to go to various places in order to be able to live, right? That's a human right to be able to live, to have access. Should be human right to have access to education, to have access to healthcare, right? Basic basic needs, right? And so we see that joining of ideology between union activists and civil rights activists. And so speaking of unions, right, one of the major players in the game, so to speak, is the United Farm Workers, which was established in 1962 by both Chicanx and Filipinx people, right? And so some of the major players within the United Farm Workers and all of these strategies that they employed, right? A lot of them coming from the strategies of the civil rights movement, comes from the ideologies of Cesar Chavez, right? Phillips Vera Cruz, Dolores Huerta, Larry Italiong, and I'm hoping I'm saying these activists' names right? So as you go through the module, you'll learn a little bit about each of them because they really started this people's movement, this farm workers movement that gave strategies and really community support, so that these farm workers could get living wages. Farm workers and other workers like garment workers, they're some of the most exploited laborers that we have in the United States. And so looking at the history of the UFW and these people who, work together to create not only a union to protect these exploited laborers, but who has been able to shift some of the what do I want to say? That have been able to create systemic change within labor. That's what I want to say. And as I mentioned, we also need to talk about movements for racial justice, right? And when we're talking about racial justice, we're talking about a society without racial oppression, right? And so a lot of these liberation movements, a lot of these social justice movements are movements for racial justice. These civil rights movements are also movements for racial justice, right? Because most of the violations of people's civil rights at the foundation is racism, right? And so when we talk about the civil rights movement, right, that happened between 1954 and 68, we're talking about, an attack on Jim Crow and anti-black racism, right? And so this was a collective attack that was within four sectors, right? And so the first sector was labor activism, as we just talked about, union and UFW, right? Legal activism. And what we're talking about legal activism, we're talking about, attacking Jim Crow in the courts, right? So we're talking about the Brown versus Board of Education and other educational court cases that, discriminated against Black students. We're talking about direct action, nonviolent, mass direct actions. And we're talking about that. We're talking about, the bus boycott. We're talking about freedom riders. We're talking about those type of direct action, right? That was not, now I would say that was nonviolent on the activist side. It was very violent on the aggressor side, right? The actual direct action was very violent. A lot of people were either beaten almost to death, and some people were murdered within the civil rights movement. But that's what we're talking about, nonviolent mass direct action, right? Think of Rosa Parks and the bus boycott, right? Or the march across, I can't think of the bridge, but the march across the Montgomery Bridge. That's not right. Oh, Selma. The Selma March. Lord. But then we also have this assertion of Black self-determination. That means that we need to be able to determine our economic rights, our political rights, right? Because during this time, during the civil rights movement, right, we were also being discriminated within politically discriminated. We were also being politically discriminated, right? In the form of disfranchisement, we couldn't vote, right? So you have the voting activism with it during this time, people going out into the South, registering Black people to vote. And within that movement, a lot of people also was injured badly and or murdered. But then you also have this Black Power movement, right? So one of the defining features of the civil rights movement is that it was a nonviolent movement. It was the concept, this ideology of being able to resist without violence, right? But the Black Power movement also saw, again, even though it's nonviolent direct action, right? It was violent because of the aggressors against these activists. The Black Power movement thought, why is it okay for these activists, these community members, these children to be beaten, killed, right, without impunity, right? And so they decided to basically take their civil rights, right? For example, they you can see a lot of the images of Black Panthers. That was one of the major symbols of the Black Power movement. You can see these photos with their rifles, right? And that was their taking taking their civil rights back by using the Second Amendment, the right to carry guns, right? The right to be armed, right? If that is a right for people who are quote unquote citizens, then Black people should have that right, who are citizens, right? And so you see them carrying these rifles because they are really taking civil rights back versus resisting against the system, right? And so the Black Power movement, which was really the transition from the civil rights movement, because you got the younger generation saying, you know what, I ain't getting beat no more, right? You got the younger generation coming with this Black national, this proud to be Black nationalism, right? And so that's characterized by, the Black Fist or the Afro. But you also see this concept of them being separate. They don't want to have to live and deal within this white oppressive world anymore, right? And so this concept of separatism starts to emerge out of this movement. You also see this concept of self-sufficiency versus, in my opinion, some of the assertions, this fighting against a white system to be included in the white system. You see the Black Power movement showing that we can be self-sufficient and separate without the need of really the dominant society's resources, right? And then again, that armed resistance, right? Again, really saying that we are, quote unquote, Americans. We are protected by the U.S. Constitution. We have the right to bear arms, right? And so, again, seeing those photos, seeing them patrolling their streets, right, with these rifles in their hands, rightfully so. But you also have during this time, queer people of color resisting oppressive and discriminative legal laws and what do I want to say? Well, laws, right? And individual discrimination. So you have things like Compton cafeteria riots in 1966. And I just want to say that this was not a riot, it was an uprising. I noticed that we like to use riots to really kind of dismiss the reason why someone is uprising or rebelling against a social system. And so the context for this is that there were laws in place that specifically targeted non-gender conforming and trans people. For example, anti-cross-dressing ordinance, as well as the sex work that a lot of them were only able to get because they were non-gender conforming, non-binary, and trans folks, right? And so in response to the uprising, the trans and drag communities were banned from this restaurant called Compton Cafeteria, right? But it was actually, this was the first, this cutie pot, and what I mean cutie pot, right? I'm talking about queer, trans, and people of color, social justice movement, this first queer militant movement, right? Where they were not being violent on purpose, right? But were defending themselves, right? Because of being targeted. And when I mean targeted, I'm talking about violently targeted, being targeted to be beaten up, to be murdered, to be killed. And that is still happening today. But this is the first known queer militant resistance to people of color. To police brutality. And you see that, in this picture, these are black folks, but this also, the cafeteria riots were also involved, also involved Latinos and white trans people and non-gender conforming people. Then you have the Stonewall riot. Again, not a riot, but an uprising. But if you were to research, it will have the riot. But this happened in 1969 at the Stonewall Inn. And this was a space that was owned by a mafia family, the Genovese family. And so because it was a space that allowed all people, but specifically queer folks, right? LGBTQ folks. And then you have Stonewall Riot, which again, not a riot, but an uprising. But if you research it, you'll find it under riot. happening in 1969. And I'm telling you, queer people were becoming more militant because of the oppression, the discrimination, the violence that they were experiencing simply because of their sexual identity and their gender identity. And when I'm talking about violence, physical violence, but also they were losing their jobs, right? And I can tell you from firsthand experience as a queer person who grew up in the 80s and 90s that folks were getting fired for being trans, non-binary, non-gender conforming, and otherwise non-heterosexual looking. And so it was a really bad time. That's why you find a lot of folks similar to the cafeteria riots, a lot of queer people during this time engaging in sex work because they were discriminated in the labor sector, right? And so when we talk about the Stonewall Inn, the uprising happened at the Stonewall Inn, and again was in response to police brutality, very similar to the cafeteria riot. But the Stonewall Inn was owned by this mafia family called the Genovese family. And so because there was a lot of queer people who were frequenting, excuse me, this space and some other aspects of the space, it was set up so that police wouldn't interfere. And so in order to basically to basically what do I want to say here? So in order to keep the bar on the down low, right? It was set up as a bottle club, right? And a bottle club was usually a private club, right? Meaning that you would have to sign in order to even get in, right? And that maintained this illusion of exclusivity, right? One where if it's a private party, then police wouldn't interfere. But also, you didn't have to have things like liquor licenses. I'm just saying. um, but it didn't really deter police from coming and raiding the bar, right? Mostly because folks of non-binary folks, gender non-conforming, transgendered folks, right? These were the main customers, right? And so again, being embodying these identities, right, was illegal. It was illegal. And so you have a lot of police coming in, raiding these bars, beating up trans women and trans men and non-binary people, and arresting them, right, simply for existing. I just want to and so when we talk about the Stonewall riot, right, we're talking about an uprising resisting against being illegal, right? And having human rights and having, civil rights, right? And so I wanted to highlight this person who is a part of the Stonewall riot because she was the reason that this uprising happened. Her name is Stormy Delaverre. I don't know if I'm saying that right. But when the Stonewall riot happened, right? It happened because she was hit over the head. One of the police officers hit her over the head. But before that, right, they were arresting people, throwing them in their paddy wagon. They were there to jail trans folks and non-binary people, right? And so this lesbian, this cross-dressing, and they call her a lesbian, but who knows? I mean, cross-dressing lesbian, because even when you're a lesbian, you would have gotten arrested for dressing masculine, right? Um, was the catalyst for this uprising, and so you can see that the '60s were really a time for direct action and militant action, regardless of sexual identity, because all of these uprisings were happening across gender and sexuality, right? And so, as a result of Stonewall, right, we get organizations and publications that, are talking about queer liberation, right? We get organizations like the Gay Liberation Front, which was born out of this need and expanded to an international organization. Because guess what? Homophobia is not just a national issue, right? And so, within these systems, within these organizations, these sites of resistance, right? You see them raising consciousness about capitalist system that oppresses queer people or otherwise, profits off of queer people. I'm thinking about all of these mainstream corporation clothing stores that are, when Pride Month comes, here comes the rainbow flags, right? Encouraging queer people to assert their visibility and claiming political power, right? And you start to see that. You see that legacy of Stonewall today. There's a lot of first trans people in office right now. There's a lot of first openly lesbian in the president's cabinet right now, right? There's a lot of openly gay men and in Congress, right? And so you see the legacy of Stonewall in our society today. And so I also want to talk about reclaiming Alcatraz, the liberation movements of indigenous folks, right? 1969, you have indigenous people occupying Alcatraz. And so in this action of reclaiming Alcatraz, because when you look it up, you'll see something that says occupying Alcatraz, but this is this is indigenous land, right? So you have indigenous folks reclaiming Alcatraz, and so there was an organization called IAT, or Indians of All Tribes, that claimed that the island Alcatraz, after they closed the prison, right? It sat there. And so the Treaty of Fort Laramie, and this is a treaty between the United States and the Sioux Nation in 1868, says the treaty returned to Native peoples all retired, abandoned, and out of use federal lands, which means that since Alcatraz was no longer in use, it should have been returned back to the Native people, right? And so what they asserted during this time, right, was that Alcatraz was more suitable for an Indian reservation as determined by the white man's own standards. In that, one, it's isolated from modern facilities and without adequate means of transportation. 2, it has no fresh running water. 3, it has inadequate sanitation facilities. 4, there are no oil or mineral rights. 5, there is no industry, and so unemployment is very great. This is crazy. 6, there are no healthcare facilities. 7, the soil is rocky and non-productive, and the land does not support game. 8, there are no educational facilities. 9, the population has always exceeded the land base. 10, the population has always held as prisoners and kept dependent upon others, right? Their list of demands, the activists' list of demands, included the return of Alcatraz to American Indians and sufficient funding to build, maintain, and operate an Indian cultural complex and university, right? And so you see not only the reclamation of land by indigenous people on Alcatraz, you see it across the nation, right? And so again, community as sites of resistance, right? And I want to end this with Black Lives Matter, because this is, something that I'm very versed in. I'm a Black Studies scholar. And so let's talk about Black Lives Matter as one of the contemporary movements. And I will say that this is an ethnic, interracial social justice movement. You see, things like Asians for Black Lives Matter. You see things like Jewish people for Black Lives Matter. You see all these type of signs. And you see this in their action as well, right? We kind of want to harp on the division, but really Black Lives Matter, when we have support, it is an inter-ethnic and interracial support. So first thing is Black Lives Matter was founded by 3 Black women, 2 who self-identify as queer, and 1 the daughter of undocumented immigrants, right? And so this right here, I want to just say, very similar to the civil rights movement, and the tenets of the Black Power movement. You know, a lot of people think of the civil rights movement, they think of Rosa Parks and they think of Martin Luther King, but they don't think of Bayard Rustin, who was really Martin Luther King's secondhand man, right? And he really taught Martin about the nonviolent strategy that was, being preached by Gandhi and other people, right? But he is rarely mentioned. A lot of people don't know him, and it was simply because he was a gay Black man. And so it's really fitting that some of the tenets of the Black Power movement is assertion of Black nationalism, and I would say for this generation and the younger generation, there's this assertion of identity. So to know that this large social justice movement was founded by marginalized identities such as Black women, such as people who are queer, such as somebody who is, in relation to undocumented immigrants. Like, these are the people that are some of the most marginalized folks in the United States. And so this Black Lives Matter, right, in response, damn it, I did it again. Just like, the other, in response to police brutality, right, was founded by 3 intersectional people, 3 people who have intersectional identities, right? And so the first person, Alicia Garza, right, she's one of the queer folks, right? She would describe this moment for the movement as a real paradigm shift. Right, it's an indicator of what's to come, but it is also, she thinks, points to the agency, right, that we have collectively to change our conditions. And so even though this is centering Black folks and Black experience, I think that all marginalized and oppressed people should take point. This concept of resisting, this concept of movement, right, and pan-ethnicity and collectively moving, interethnic movement, all of these things, right, points to the agency that we have to change our conditions. And so this is the importance of resisting these oppressive ideologies, these oppressive conditions, because we can change this, right? And so the second founder, who also identifies as queer, Patrisse Cullors, says that Black Lives Matter reminds people that Black people are human, but more importantly, it reminds Black people that we are human. And there's so many opponents of Black Lives Matter, people who want to say all lives matter, right? And in a society, we know that all lives matter, but in reality, right, when we see, a community being gunned down, being discriminated against, being excluded, right? There is something that says you don't really care about our lives, right? And so the assertion, again, the legacy of the Black Power movement, the assertion of our we're demanding our lives matter, right? As a Black person, I am Black Lives Matter, right? And so we are human. It's not saying that anyone else is not human, but our reality says that people don't see us as human. Otherwise, how can you violently kill, discriminate against us, oppress us so freely, and legally, individually, socially, right? Think about that when you want to say all lives matter. And then the last founder is the daughter of undocumented parents, right? And she says, quite honestly, that's why I like the phrase Black Lives Matter, says Tomatetti, right? Because it wasn't just about the Mike Brown case, right? Trayvon Martin, Renisha McBrown, these all people who were murdered by police. It wasn't just these singular names, which are extremely important. She says that she can never take away from their individual lives and love that their families and communities have for them. But what was important, she says, right, is that we are living in a society, right, where systematically our loved ones could be taken from us and there would be no justice, right? This is the reality that we're referring to when we scream Black Lives Matter, that we are human, right? If we were seen as human, could our lives be taken from us systematically in an instant, and there would be no justice? Could that actually coexist, right? So, just a little tidbit. Hopefully, this has given you some insight on the history of liberation movements, social justice movements in the United States.